One, we won't be soft. I'm happy to take the trade-off that maybe the economy in our side is going to grow less, but the counterfactual we get in our side is a more stable economy. I'm going to justify that later down the speech. Three claims. Firstly, on principle, why people have more autonomy over their lives. Secondly, on why we think we reduce the reckless investment behavior of banking, which safeguards the future of people on the ground. And finally, on why stable economy is preferable to an unstable but fast-growing one. I'm framing before that. I think the vast majority, and notice the emphasis says that by default, all accounts are going to be hedged against government bonds. But crucially, consumers have the ability to consent into equity accounts as well if they want to. But I think generally speaking, the vast majority of people are gonna remain out of equity accounts to more safe accounts anyway for three reasons. One, people generally prefer their autonomy; they don't want their money to be used elsewhere. Or like used in like risky investments. Secondarily, people generally have a fear of banks fucking things up, especially post 2008. And thirdly, just human beings are generally very risk averse. We don't want to do things that might screw over our future or our kids' future. More importantly, I think government bonds are generally quite stable. One, just macroeconomic concept, governments are able to keep the valuation stable. But secondarily, the point in time more people have their accounts and their money be hedged behind these government bonds, they automatically become more stable. Similar to how, for example, when many countries trade in the dollar also coincidentally and corollary becomes stable. First claim on the principle. Notice panel that in capitalism, which is the vast majority of contexts and economies in the world, money is fundamentally equal to choice. It is being able to decide what kind of college your kid goes to, is able to decide how your retirement looks like. Notice, however, when you put your money in a bank account, that money essentially disappears. It is just numbers on a screen. You no longer have any physical access to it. The problem then is that you're essentially giving up your autonomy to a financial institution. Their management of your money is what decides if, for example, your savings are going to vanish in 2 years or you're going to make dividends off that. We think just generally speaking in our side, giving people an option to choose between a savings account that is riskier but has high rewards compared to a more risk-less profile in savings is something that enables people to have a greater autonomy over their life, to be able to choose how they want to spend their money and spend their crucial investments on. We think we're better on that regard. Before I move on, I'll take Sharia.
On your principle, I can also just buy bonds right now, which is the literal exact same thing. This is not a principal difference.
No, it's not about buying bonds. It's about ensuring that the money that you're giving to the bank is hedged against bonds, so the money doesn't disappear in a bank run. It's as simple as that. Secondly, why is it necessary? Why is this policy necessary to prevent reckless behavior from banks? Three structural reasons as to why banks on a balance of probability tend to prefer risky investments as opposed to riskless investments. Number one, moral hazard, right? Many of these banks are oftentimes too big to fail, which is to say that they expect there to be bailouts because they think that if we fail, the entire economy goes to shit. The government has no other choice than to give us money. This encourages banks to engage in risky behavior, knowing that they're always guaranteed bailouts in case the risk goes south. But secondarily, notice that oftentimes banks make risky choices based on predictability of the economy. They assume the economy is doing good right now. They predict maybe it's going to do good for a couple of years, and they make the investment. Notice, however, the economy is prone to exogenous shocks, things like pandemics, things like climate crises, which is probably going to increase in propensity as time goes on, right? These exogenous shocks means that investments that are looking good in 2024 might suddenly be completely horrible in 2026, by which time banks are oftentimes going to fail or lose a lot of money. Thirdly, the economic model to which bank administrators are oftentimes brought up in is West-centric models. In places like Stanford, in places like Harvard, which oftentimes teach very, very risky free market models of bank investment, which means that the language that these sorts of bank administrators speak is one that veers them towards risk. The nuance here is important. These bank failures don't happen every single day, don't happen every single year. But when they do happen every once in a while, it is catastrophic in the long term. People lose their entire life savings because suddenly the bank doesn't have money to pay them back. You have things like jobs that you lose and which structurally lock you into poverty, oftentimes for generations, right? The question is, why are governments then able to regulate this quite well? And why is regulation that on our side is going to be quite rigorous? The first thing to point out is that post 2008, there's immense political pressure on governments to ensure banks don't do risky things, right? risky things, which means then that if for example the government doesn't regulate strongly and allows things like these to happen in the future, then they're going to face immense political pressure and they're going to go out of power, perhaps even for a long time. So regulators like the FDC, I think is like the US one, has a strong incentive to do this really, really well. Secondarily, I want to know that there's oftentimes sustained political capital for government regulators. The reason for this is that economies by nature go through periods of slight boosts, slight like upturns and downturns, right? During those downturns, you're always going to have returning conversations about accountability, which means there's a constant reinjection of political capital towards accountability, towards regulation. But thirdly, notice that governments have a pragmatic incentive oftentimes to ensure banks don't fail. Because when banks fail, governments are the ones that have to spend billions of dollars to pick up the tab, restrict their ability to do things like fund their projects, like building bridges that give them legitimacy. All of these things mean then government regulation on our side can solve the issue and can solve it quite well. I want to finally thirdly talk about why stable economy is preferable to an unstable, fast-growing economy. Three structural reasons. The first thing to point out is that we think that a stable economy protects the most vulnerable instead of benefiting the most privileged. Because note number one, in times of economic prosperity, when investment is booming, when the tech sector is doing great, the people are getting dividends of that are the tech bros in Silicon Valley, not the people living in Midwest, in suburbs after Chicago, etc. These people don't get the fruits of economic prosperity. In contrast, when economies go to shit, companies and corporations are oftentimes fine. They either get bailouts or they have a lot of revenue anyway to cushion the cost during times of crisis. However, the people who suffer the most are those who don't have, who have like $1,000 saved at max in their bank accounts, who lose their jobs, who aren't able to afford their kids' college anymore, or oftentimes lose their mortgage because they can't pay it back anymore, specifically because downturns affect the most vulnerable more. Secondarily, we think stability is better for developing nations as well, because notice that risk investment in developing nations oftentimes with low credit scores like Bangladesh is very, very difficult because because investors see them as risky profiles. In our side, when the financial institutions that the economy fundamentally based upon invest in like risk-like asset, the economy is seen as more stable, incentivizing significantly more FDI, which increases things like employment, skill transference, and also generally money and foreign reserves. But thirdly, we prevent economic overheating. Oftentimes, too much growth causes inflation, which raises prices and makes people's lives worse. For all of these reasons, panel, a narrow banking regulation is the answer to corporate account accountability. I'm extraordinarily glad to propose.
Cheers, PM. Hello, whenever you're ready. Let's start by unpacking this motion that was so incomprehensible to me that I didn't get what the fuck the debate was about for like 5 minutes of prep. Two types of accounts now open at every bank. Yes, there's the equity account, which is the only one that is allowed to lend out your deposit, and there's the personal account, which vast majority of people will choose. Why will vast majority of people choose one? Because they're encouraged to be safe by the overwhelming culture of, you need to protect your family's livelihood above all else against risk, etc., etc. Two, because that is the one that the regulators are going to some degree going to push you into, especially since this is going to be backed in government bonds. And three, just because this is going to be the one that people are kind of defaulting to. They're not going to be defaulting to the one that is that is coded like investment equity account, etc., etc. Again, this is the way that banking system generally work. You don't want to, like, vast majority of people go for the safest, most predictable kind of stuff. What this implies is that a lot of people are not going to be able to, like, again, people who have an explicit interest and not just status quo biased interest into having safety specifically, and they care about it enough to actually research, etc., have an option of buying government bonds, which are the safest assets. What this means is it implies two things. One, in terms of the consequences of this policy, before we go into discussing why those consequences are bad or good. One, there's going to be a lot less private sector loans for everyone, which, is going to slow down growth, which OG explicitly concedes. And two, more importantly, that government has a fuck ton of money to spend and waste. Two things, therefore, in our case. One, government is really bad at investing, and private sector is better, the comparative case. Two, investments from a private sector is good for the economy, even absent the kind of comparative of government investing. Let's go into the comparative case first. Government is really bad at investing. 3 reasons why governments are beholden to the people. One, because the governments are beholden to the people. They're beholden to specific regions, and they want to invest in specific regions from which are swing states, etc. In situations in which there is some level of swing, and especially since vast majority of countries are operating under first past the post ballot for getting into elections. What this means is that essentially only one person gets in from any single region. Like, yes, this is vast majority of countries in the world. I know that you live in Ireland, which is different, but Ireland is not is the exception, not the rule. Like America, the biggest democracy. Australia is first past the post, I believe. UK, obviously first past the post. Essentially, most countries are first past the post. Whatever. Point is that you're going to invest only in the ones in which the government is vulnerable to losing seats. Why? Because it cares primarily about its political survival rather than about the economic stability. I think we all debated this in round 5 to some degree, and we know that, like, yes, people are going to be significantly disadvantaged from investing into profitable ventures because they are beholden to their short-term incentives. 2, because government has to pander to the people. They can't do investment that looks bad at the point where they are, dealing with people's money. That doesn't necessarily mean bad investments. That means investments that doesn't seem good to the uninformed voter, because vast majority of voters are not going to be tech bros who understand how economics actually works and who understand what investments are actually good. At that point, the government is heavily encouraged to do investments that look good. What does this mean? It means shit like Venezuela building a dam instead of actually focusing this on a profitable venture and then going bankrupt because it had too much money that it controlled entirely, because again, it monopolized oil sales, and essentially the government controlled all of this. 3, because essentially the government is worse than the private incentives, than the private market, because 1, it has to go through a lot of red tape. Like, the investments are just significantly slower. The government has a lot less capacity to do those investments at crucial times that are going to be beneficial for creating this investment in a time beneficial manner, in the way that private sector is not. Private sector is able to diversify risks a lot more also, because it has a lot more actors working towards creating this investment well. Why is that the case? Because again, government is putting all of its money, like, from the private accounts, which most people are going to choose as per framing, and also as per OG concession, which is why I didn't spend that much time on it, because OG agrees on this. That essentially means that the government has a lot of money to spend, and it is the single actor that is spending this. I think that the most charitable interpretation of Gov, which I fully expect from CG, is that it's going to go into like diverse state-owned companies that are going to invest into many different factors, etc. But there's 2 problems with that. One, they are still politically those state-owned companies are still politically vulnerable to subversion, especially in developing countries. Poland is not a developing country anymore, but it is kind of exiting that status. I think that this majority of democracies are less developed than Poland in terms of its political incentives. And at the point where we had one government that was kind of shady, it was able to monopolize the entirety of the spending of the state sector by essentially stuffing it with political appointees that were incredibly loyal to the governing party. That means that it's incredibly vulnerable to subversion in the way that private market is not, because private market is operating on the profit incentive, which means that win or lose, you're going to know what incentives you're operating on, which gives you stability as a business investing in that country. You know that the investment is going to be done by people who are going to operate on the same principles as you. On the comparative, vast majority of investments in that economy are going to be handled by the government. That is a bad thing, because now the private sector doesn't really know how to respond, which means that you are less attractive to FDI, which means that you have a lot less money, which means that essentially the way that your economy grows, like, there's a lot less jobs, there's a lot less people who are feeling like who can advance in life, who have their needs met, who have businesses that they can start, who have loans that they can get access to in the way that they want. Closing. Opening.
Your alternative is that people can just buy government bonds. The vast majority of people, especially in developing nations, don't even know what government bonds are and how they work. But the majority of people do have bank accounts. So your alternative is a bit unviable.
No. Okay. So 2 things here. 1, yes, there's an alternative. Like, this is still an alternative that exists. On your side of the house, you are preventing people. Okay. Actually, no, I don't think that this is correct. I think that people just don't really understand economics very well. I think that this is the actual reality here. And you're correct. Most people don't understand economics, and most people don't do the decisions that are correct for them. This is correct. Yes, you're right. That means that at the point where you are telling them, oh, look, this is this risk-free account and this is this risky account, they're going to go for the risk-free account because, they want to protect their family, etc. But that also means that there's a complete slowdown in the economy. It means that people don't have jobs, and it means that there's no investment into the actual liquidity of the economy. Like, the economy is just paralyzed. It doesn't grow. People don't have jobs. Like, companies don't expand, and FDI doesn't come. So yes, I guess, but like it's irrelevant because people don't care about it enough and people don't understand this enough to make informed decisions one way or the other. On both sides of the house, you're making the choice for them. So the responsibility principle of the government is to make sure that options of people are maximized and that the economic status of people is maximized. That means that you do not follow a policy that is going to be catastrophic to your long-term growth prospects and to their job prospects, because you're a steward of their money, you're a steward of the way that they should be growing. And again, I think that there's a second point, which is, especially applicable in developing countries, which is that at the point where the government is unaccountable to the people, at the point where people don't understand, especially when they don't have this kind of education, the government can just spend their money on corrupt projects that don't contribute anything to the economy and contribute towards either cronyistic incentives, like essentially how Venezuela collapsed into dictatorship. It collapsed because the government was too corrupt to actually, spend the money well and gave money to people affiliated with the government. But two, they are just giving this money to the people who are not doing the best from it, because they're not capable of making this investment well, because they're not nuanced enough, they're not diverse enough, etc., etc. And they are significantly less well motivated than the government, than the private sectors, who are, motivated by their profit rather than by political considerations and by, catering to a certain region rather than to the actual overall health of the economy. So proud to oppose.
Cheers, LR, DPM whenever you're ready.
Look, we're happy to stand behind slower economic growth. Like, I actually don't mind it that much. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to explain why governments are actually good at spending money, noting that a lot of opening opposition analysis on this seems to be Venezuela bad. Like, insofar as, first of all, they are beholden to the people, that means they want to do good stuff for the people. So if the people want a dam, then they will build a dam. Notice, Venezuela is a unique case insofar as their government was especially corrupt. I don't think this debate applies in specifically Venezuela. I think it applies in a lot more contexts in which governments probably have better incentives and are probably marginally more competent. Why are they more competent in various instances? The first is oftentimes they're able to cooperate with the private sector because, note, the private sector benefits from effective government investment. That is to say, at the point where the government is able to build accessible roads or build accessible public transportation or provide accessible healthcare. You know what the private sector doesn't have to do? The private sector doesn't have to build those roads. And you know what they can do instead? It means they are better able to hire the best people, because if you have better transportation from one place to another, that means if you are setting up your company in one place, you can hire people from another place because they can get to your company really fast. If you're able to provide healthcare, then companies no longer have to give you healthcare plans because the government has a good healthcare plan. In this way, private sectors frequently benefit from effective government investment, and so there's likely to be a degree of cooperation because governments also benefit from effective government investment because then people like them more. Second is you want to create jobs, and creating jobs means that you do projects that fund jobs. And the final thing is just better able to coordinate stuff, right? As far as you are the government and you have access to sub-government or local administrations and constituencies or whatever, you're able to coordinate larger instances. You're able to have a large degree of cooperation, which means you are able to better connect places in more effective ways and do projects that are useful. But why is private investment likely to happen anyways to a significant extent, even if it's not to the same huge extent that they talk about? I think there's a few reasons. The first, that we probably are going to get lower interest rates on our side of the house for two reasons. The first is that insofar as reducing interest rates by the central bank is able to increase the value of bonds because people are less likely to want to buy newer issued bonds that would have higher value if you had higher interest. It means that central banks are if people rely on these bonds, central banks are likely to lower this interest rate. But the second thing, this is crucial, if the government doesn't actually have to spend all the money they get, right? Because a lot of countries have a large amount of national debt. What we're able to do is when people are buying more bonds or are buying bonds for a higher amount, the government now has more money. And so the national debt is able to decrease, which means you no longer have the same amount of inflation because oftentimes inflation is caused by high national debt. And so as a result, you don't have to have high interest rates to compensate for that. What this means is that you probably have a degree of lower interest rates on our side of the house. This hugely incentivizes investment from private entities because it means that more likely to make their money if they open a business or invest in another person's business and put their money into a bank account. But the final reason is that a lot of the investment in economic growth and job growth nowadays isn't from banks and equity accounts anyway. It's from venture capitalists, right? People with lots of money who are probably going to be investing on both sides of the house because they want to disrupt the market or whatever, right? These people aren't reliant to the same extent, it's a handful of people with access to a lot of capital who are going to be putting their money into equity accounts anyways, because these people really like making lots of money and they have enough money that they're willing to be able to risk a lot of it. So these people are going to be putting their money into equity accounts on our side of the house, and they're still going to get a degree of investment in this thing. The delta then is maybe very slightly slower economic growth, but the trade-off is the people who care about stability are more able to access it. Because I want to note something very clearly. In the status quo, a lot of banks aren't particularly transparent about how they're investing. Even if they are, oftentimes it's not particularly verifiable. If I open a bank account, I can't actually investigate all the time to see how they're investing my money. But finally, I think a lot of times when people create their bank accounts, they don't do the work to investigate it anyway. And so far as like when I made a bank account because I had a job and I needed to have the money to be sent to my bank account, I didn't do an investigation to the nature of how this bank invests my money in any specific way. I just like did the first thing I found, right? I think a lot of people when they're opening bank accounts aren't actually in a position to be able to like investigate bank accounts thoroughly, and they kind of leave it behind. This is important because Amelia notes that a lot of people have preferences for stability. But she says it's because like, oh, they are socially raised to do it. But like that still means you have a preference for stability. It's something that you want, something that you idealize, something that you would want to have. Which means on our side of the house, insofar as the majority of accounts that you are likely to be investing in, if you like are default just investing blindly because of what Amelia said, are now going to be substantially more stable, these people are better able to access their preferences in this regard. Comparatively, if I do want to do risky investments, I'm the type of person who's probably going to be looking into it anyways, and so I'll be able to invest in equity accounts if I want faster but riskier economic growth for myself. I want to be very clear here, right? Because they say, the people who really care about stability can probably just invest in government bonds anyways. But I think the majority of people who care about stability aren't in the position to be doing high amounts of research or types of investment they're doing anyways. The majority of people who care about stability are people who like work a 9 to 5 and they have kids and they just want to send a kid to school and they don't have like degrees in econ or finance to understand how any of this stuff works. They just want to make sure the money like keeps growing a bit and that if something really bad happens, they're able to survive, right? And so on our side of the house, I think these people are better able to access types of preferences that they want. Quickly then, why government-backed bonds are actually going to be especially stable. Apart from the fact that government are like you have large amounts of faith in them, I think there's two other reasons. The first, that the central bank is able to engage in things like quantitative easing, where they literally just buy a bond in order to increase the value. And the second is that governments, just broadly speaking, have a larger capacity to carry on debt, and companies they're less likely to default in this specific regard. And why equity is frequently not going to be particularly stable, I think apart from the incentive stuff that we tell you, there's also just a capacity thing insofar as like it's often incredibly difficult to assess the underlying value of a stock because the people who are advertising the stock are obviously going to be lying and misinforming it. And so the extent to which you're able to understand the value of a stock when you engage in investment is unclear and it's often not going to be totally accurate. We rectify this in a few ways. The first is just trivially, banks are less able to invest and financial institutions are less able to invest in riskier stock insofar as they have like this normal account that people are investing in. But the second, before I do the second, does closing have a point? Engagement. Opening, yeah, what do you want?
CO,
Oh yeah, CO, go, hurry up.
don't you actually think that investment in risky areas is better because it means innovation and investment in startups, which you do not get if government bonds are exclusive to safe?
See the venture capitalist stuff. People who care about this sort of stuff can probably access it. And I don't think it's justified for you to take people's money who care about stability and say, actually, what's more important for you is this long-term economic growth that can result in market volatility. I think there's just a principal harm there insofar as people want stability rather than like the large-term economic growth chunk. Anyways, the second way we rectify it, this is a cool thing, is that the people who care about risky investments in terms of like making these investments themselves, like investment bankers who heavily prioritize risk because they want to have like large bonuses or whatever, leave. They work on the bank accounts that specifically focus on equity because they understand that the capacity to access that sort of stuff in these in the previous accounts is substantially reduced, right? And so as a result, the people who want to have access to equity accounts now have a larger pool of equity bankers to choose from because they're able to specifically target where they're putting their money, right? So ultimately, I think we win because we're able to, first of all, access more people's preferences. Insofar as the default preference for most people is going to be stability, they're more likely to be investing in these stable bank accounts. I think that's in and of itself good. Second reason we win, though, is that we just have more stable economic growth. We have substantially reduced volatility, and so the intensity of harms associated with like crashes is just substantially reduced on our side of the house. For these reasons, propose.
Thanks, DPM. To finish off opening half, DLR.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yep.
Okay, CG did not give us a POI in hello. I'm going to ask CG for a POI in DLO. For engagement, I want to engage. I will try to take at least one, and I hope they will take two, considering they have not engaged with us twice. Okay. Let's be real. Obviously, the venture capitalist mitigation from OG is minimal because the vast majority of the money in the economy comes from people in the economy who put their money in banks. So obviously, a huge amount of money is no longer going into investment. The reasons Amelia gave you for this are not something you can ignore in this debate or frame out. The first obvious reason is that people are highly risk averse because of cultural narratives that tell you should not gamble your money in the stock market. It's literally an economic puzzle as to why people don't put their money into a 10% confirmed return over decades of independent, of evidence. It's because people just do not like risks, and hence they don't want to put their money into equity accounts for these cultural reasons. But second of all, also because a lot of these plans are in the long term. You want your kids' education to make sense. You want to make sure that you have money in your retirement fund. As a result of that, you don't invest in the equity account because you need to make sure it's there. You don't care about the returns. All of this means you put the money into that account. Third, the reasons OG gave, which is that the bank defaults you into putting the money there. This is really crucial because it's like literally hundreds of billions of dollars in big economies, and in small economies it's probably all of them, because in the more developing economies which are poorer, people don't want to take any risks because literally losing your money a little bit could mean that you absolutely cannot pay for your bills tomorrow at all. This is already a thing that banks use because you can access your money in most banks right now in these poor economies, but in this instance pretty much every developing nation will put all of their money into these accounts. This is important because it sets the extent of this debate into focus. It gives you three implications now. First of all, I want to talk about governments and crises, because the best case of government is that supposed, as a government side, is that supposedly this reduces crises, right? Because you're not investing into difficult things, bank runs don't occur. The first thing I want to point out is that governments are so much more risky than banks. The first reason for this is that they're short-termist and have welfare incentives, which is crucially important, especially in poorer nations, because the simplest way to get votes, just pay someone food for like food subsidies, or just give them a stimulus check, and then they will want to actually vote for you, because it's the simplest way for them to think about all the complicated policies without engaging in a discussion and intellectual debate about which of these will grow the economy or not. So often, if you look at places like Venezuela, which did not start off as failing economies, they became significantly more state controlled because people started spending more and more money on welfare. Second of all, subsidies and stimulus checks can't be rolled back because often these companies become dependent on them to the point where they would fail without them. Look at the companies in South American nations before they privatized. Often they were completely dependent on government funding, at the point where which if they started not having that subsidy, a lot of people would be fired. There would be reduced employment, which is so politically unpopular to keep them alive, too big to fail effectively. The problem is that this is also true now, because if all this money is going to the government, it's not just about banks, which I think should be too big to fail. It's every single company which cannot fail at all. So you have to keep giving them that money, often which rises in time because you no longer have the incentive to reduce your costs, because the government will cover that for you. At that point, often these companies become lazier and don't become efficient, which raises cost over time. The third thing is that it also creates political incentives to expect more from the next government. So people offer more and more stimulus checks, more and more money. The fourth reason is that there's an immense lack of oversight, because the actual budget is often controlled by very few people who are politically incentivized to spend this money in big projects, like say external projects outside in the country, making sure you have like white elephant projects that make you look very effective and optical. But the issue is if there is just billions and billions and billions of dollars, and there is not enough people to make sure there is oversight of it, because the government does not have hundreds of thousands of employees in the same way that a company often can hire. At that point, it is easy to skim that money off the top, particularly importantly, because the regulatory oversight for the government is coming from the government itself, at which point you often do not have independent systems that check it, but investments from private sector is often checked very carefully, to the point where you don't waste this money or skim it off the top. The sixth and final reason is lobbying and the way the political system itself works, which is failing. First of all, voter ID laws and restrictions in documentation make it difficult for people who are like black in America, or for example, an immigrant in India who has now become nationalized, or a Bengali person who was there at a time of riots and hence lost their access to like claim to citizenship, makes it difficult for these people to vote, because it's so difficult to prove that you are a citizen. And often it's in the incentive of the parties to make sure minorities don't get this vote, often with things like gerrymandering. Second of all, lobbying obviously works importantly, because you can't run for election unless you have a lot of money from companies, which means you want to pay things to your cronies. Again, I'm not taking the best case of Gov, I'm proving that it won't be the best case in Gov. Third of all, it's because often the other considerations like culture and other things that people consider when they're voting, so they don't only think about economics, so the investments are ineffective. Often you don't notice it until it starts to fail and it's impossible to reverse. And the final thing is the lack of turnout, because often people are intimidated by the culture of politics, where if you say something that disagrees with the person next to you, you are insulted in developing nations. And also, if you do go to the polls, you don't know where it is, people don't give you that information, and it takes you so much time and energy, you don't care about it. At that point, most people are not represented if they're minorities at all. The only people who are represented are either the majority in the middle class, or people who have paid money to vote for a certain party, which obviously also benefits the majority because their party has the most money. As a result of this, governments go into debt crises. Look at Pakistan, look at what happened to Venezuela, look at countries like Zimbabwe and countries like Indonesia, who have had crashes because of government spending. vain. First, who bails them out? No one. There is no one you trust anymore because the state no longer has the amount of money to take this back, and so people suffer independently and permanently. Second of all, the system of the state itself fails. So you don't have people who can actually handle the military or the police or the government, at which point it cannot actually make sure you have the basic safety required to run your government. Third of all, at that point, financial institutions can't bring you back because they themselves are only legitimate in the instance where they would have been competitive. On the other hand, if you had this crisis because you created this dependent system, no one invests in your financial economy outside the state either. So now the country becomes open to exploitation. China makes sure to take away your resources. There are literally wars within these nations, which is significantly more risky than the crises on Gov. Fine, we have crises every 30 years. Fine, we have crises that are really bad. When the government crisis happens on our government, there is literally nothing that can do to solve it. On our side, at least the government can bail you out. This is the best case of government flip. Second of all, let's talk about the actual case in terms of what happens in the middle. Before that, CG.
Why would companies and private sector have the incentive to invest in projects like infrastructure in poor regions if they're not profitable in the short run?
They don't. The government does that. The government has some money on both sides of this debate because of taxation. Okay, what is it that the private sector does with this money? The first thing is that the private sector often invests in more effective ways based on what Amelia told you. That is because private companies often become incredibly powerful when they find gaps in the system and throw out a lot of money at lots of businesses that are likely to fail. This is particularly important because you need to compete with other middle or large companies by taking that money away from them. These are often not just like a random firm that is going to throw money into it. It's a banker giving money to someone who used to work in Amazon, has a skill set and connections to build an actual competitor to it. This is why Apple Music used to be the monopoly in the tech market, but Spotify beat it later. It's because people with this money can actually compete in the market. Second of all, it's because you have enough money to pay workers. All of this impacts in three ways. First of all, more investment and more growth generally means that people also can get better jobs because they can pick between different businesses and grow in long term. But second of all, if there's more investment in general, people can actually get the money from those companies at all. But third of all, the innovation claims that Amelia already said to you multiple times about niche systems that are highly risky are beneficial because you need to take long-term risks on many projects which are technological, which have a huge spreading effect on the economy. Because if you fix a technology for one sector, it helps every single business that benefits from it and compounds over time. These things do not happen with the government. Instead, often collapse does. In that context, the general life of an individual person becomes better on our side, and we do not want to miss the crises on government.
Thanks to DLO and to opening half. To kick off back half, Gov member.
Am I clearly visible and audible?
Yep.
I'll begin my speech then in 3, 2, 1. We're going to challenge the conception that bonds are safe and explain why it's terrible for the citizens of a state to be invested in that state generally and when there are economic crashes. First, I want to fulfill a missing burden from OO on why investment arms invest well in the private market, filling the comparative of why governments invest badly. The first reason for this is expertise. We think that OG agree with us that there will be VCs at the helm of advising banks on who they should invest in, unless a bank is large enough to have their own arm of experts in-house. These people, the advisors on where to invest, typically have the best skills and the best education for investments. So it's the people who went to the best schools, learned from the best teachers, managed to get through the hardest admissions processes in order to get a job that is highly sought after because of how well it pays. Secondly, these people typically have the best tools and the best data. It's access to huge data sets and the quantum computers that are able to analyze them, to look for similarities and differences, and look and analyze micro patterns in the trend and how certain companies trend in order to create a comprehensive understanding of where you should and should not invest. Finally, we have a natural selection of the best ones. If you have a proven record, that's what gets you hired by a bank. If you do a bad job, that's what gets you fired, and eventually you lose out. We think that most banks approach the largest and most advanced and well-proven venture capital firms to help them with investment, meaning that they make the best investment possible. We think that investment in risky things is good. Risky things have the most potential for growth. So yes, they also have the highest potential for entirely not functioning or being destroyed, but it means that they have the highest average utility predicted. As long as you don't have too much of your investments in risky stuff, it is good for you. This also leads to
innovation. In order for us to create the sort of products that are going to help people in our society, we need to innovate and do things that are risky, have a chance of failing, but a chance of answering a currently unmet need. We think that this doesn't exist on their side, because even if some proportion of the bank's funds are still invested in private equity, they won't be invested in the riskiest things, because at first you invest in things like Aramco, in big tech, and only the 20% you have left over do you invest in risky things. Moving on to our extension on why bonds aren't safe. I want to first characterize governments. Governments are short-termist. In democracies, they care about their current term. They want to be reelected. If I lose an election, then my opponent will have to deal with any economic shortfall of my policies. Not only does this not harm me, it's as a positive good thing for me. This means that things like immediately decreasing taxes, subsidizing people directly, i.e. bread subsidies in Egypt, dealing with short-term economic issues, running expensive military drills to showcase power, and in other words, wasting and spending money are great ways to win elections. This is also why governments tend to run deficits. There's no incentive to run a surplus. There are strong incentives that I just explained to run a deficit. This means that governments have to rely on borrowing in order to close that deficit. The easiest way to do this borrowing is to offer bonds and let individuals purchase government debt. Let's talk about bonds. Bonds are speculative and fiat-based. Governments can always print more bonds, taking on more debt without having to ask any specific debtor to do this. So there's also no specific debtor they owe it to. So every citizen in the state might be invested in that bond and own a tiny share of government debt. Governments are incentivized to also offer high interest rates on these bonds so that they can pay back for any immediate needs. So if currently people aren't willing to buy bonds, the way I get them to buy bonds is to offer them more of an interest rate. It's especially true for long-term bonds, i.e. 20, 50-year bonds. These rates are set exclusively by the government. So as long as they offer a high enough rate, someone will purchase them, meaning this form of funding is always available so long as you sufficiently overinflate your rates. Long-term, though, this means that bond debt tends to spiral out of control, and countries other than the United States tend to do that, which is too big to fail, often default on their bonds. First reason for this is the long-term accumulation of debt, where you're currently paying back the interest rates for bonds taken 50 years ago. Secondly, the solution to bond debt is unsustainable. You have to print more bonds. This means that if you're not able to pay back bonds currently, you have to print more bonds at a higher interest rates. Eventually, when the interest rates go too high, people lose trust in the state's ability to ever repay it, and the point at which people stop being willing to buy bonds is a point of no return. The country's only alternative method for getting money other than borrowing is to squeeze their own tax base, the companies and individuals living within them. But this is the same tax base that, in a time of crisis, has all of their savings tied up in government bonds and don't have the ability to pay more taxes because they don't have the ability to access their savings. Can you turn that off?
Yes.
Corporations are more resilient in contrast. First, it's easier for corporations to cut down on expenses. States' main spendings are on education, on pensions, on security, on infrastructure, things that are very inelastic, both in terms of people's immediate needs and in terms of the political consequences of cutting them. This means states are unable to pare down and survive through hard times. They're forced to seek further unsustainable borrowing. In contrast, corporations invest much of their funds into research and development, into marketing, into recruitment. They can scale all of these things down during times of crisis. They can also divest from tangential fields, i.e. spin off and sell one of a corporation that they bought a decade ago in a tangential field. Secondly, though, investment in corporations is more resilient because we're invested in multiple countries and fields. Before I say that, let's take a POI from OG.
A lot of innovation in big tech is automation and AI. How do you defend gambling people's life savings away just to have technology that takes their jobs away as well?
I don't think you prove that automation and AI are bad, and I think it's an entire assertion to say that the entire stock market is comprised of automation and AI. Corporations are more resilient because we're invested in multiple countries and fields. This is true both for the corporation themselves, which tends to be diversified and multinational, and for the banks, which invest in diverse corporations across multiple fields and countries, meaning that even if there's a crisis in shipping, they're invested in tech and service. Even if tech becomes obsolete, they're invested in energy and manufacturing. Even if China has another revolution, they're invested in the US and in Vietnam. All this means that even in hard times, corporations can stay afloat and can slow down their descent. They're more likely to be able to pay back your money money when you ask for it, and they're more scalar. While they may contract, they can more easily come back from that, and you can still access most of the money you invested in them, as opposed to states, which once they default, have no money that they can offer anyone. Finally, let's talk quickly about runs on the banks, because we think there's a lower threshold of domino effect of collapse on their side. If I believe the state is doing badly, then not only will the state fail to bail out banks or to subsidize my welfare, I also don't believe I'll be able to reimburse the money that my bank invested in bonds. That means that we now get runs on the banks, not only if I believe the bank is likely to fail, but also if I believe that the bank is well managed, but the state is likely to fail. For all of these reasons, closing opposition.
Thanks, op member. Gov Wit.
Hi, can you see me and hear me?
Yep.
Hey, one sec. The biggest clash in the round is to what extent government spending is good and to what extent government spending alters on both sides. Because insofar OG wants to claim their benefits of the economy being more stable, OO legitimately challenges that governments might spend money in poor ways that are worse than corporations and less stable than corporations. Insofar as we are able to resolve that clash, we're able to take the debate decisively above top half. I would note, first of all, that opening opposition and closing opposition's claims are extremely comparative, because DLO and LO give you a series of reasons why the government has a strong political incentive to overspend, but they never tie it to the motion because none of their analysis explains why the incentive to overspend would disappear on our side of the house. And the fundamental reason why this is important is because governments have many alternative means of fulfilling that overspending. Things like taking out loans from international markets, which often necessitate higher interest rates and lead to them having worse credit ratings and making their debt harder to pay back. It also looks like things like printing money, which of course in many of the developing states they talk about, like Venezuela, which precisely is what causes hyperinflation. This is the cause of economic mismanagement in the majority of the instances that opening opposition describes to you. It is not one of, the economy just generally failing because there's not enough money circulating. It is not one because governments are spending, like it is precisely one where governments are spending too much money, but they do not have enough money to spend. And that is uniquely the problem we solve on our side of the house. The only response to this argument is that you can tax companies on both sides. They have given you no reasons why this is possible. In fact, we would suggest this is highly unlikely because there is a strong incentive to decrease taxes due to the entrenched power of wealthy individuals who run corporations, due to the massive amounts of lobbying that exist on both sides of the house, that people control, that the wealthy individuals have lots of influence over how government operates because they're able to use their wealth to influence elections by doing things like campaign donations. There are patronage networks that often form, and this is precisely the mechanism opening opposition gives for why there would be massive subsidies towards companies rather than higher taxation, because these things are often run by nepotistic families in many different countries. CO response is that bonds are likely to be unstable, but this is also highly uncomparative because bonds are safer than whatever happens on their side of the house. Government-backed assets are significantly more diversified than the sort of assets banks are likely to invest into with their equity accounts. This is because things like treasury bonds are an aggregated reflection of the economy writ large, whereas banks tend to invest in things that are currently in the trajectory of upward growth, that have the highest growth potentials, and therefore are also most vulnerable to things like risks and the bubble bursting. Whereas banks tend to invest in things like mortgage-backed securities that only sample one particular sector of the economy, which creates much larger variance and much larger possibility of explosion than on our side of the house, where it's the economy writ large and includes real sectors that have like fundamental reasons why they can remain some level of stability on both sides of the house. Things like the capacity to trade with other countries, things like the fact that certain natural resources you produce will be in demand on both sides of the house, are also things that we're able to take into account in terms of our evaluation of the fair price of government bonds. Whereas on their side, it's far more speculative. Their only claim under this is that there will be more diversification. But diversification internationally is not necessarily a good thing, because when they talk about exogenous shocks to the market, these are likely equally able to affect all countries across the world. And we would suggest that it's actually called more contagion effect when, other companies who are influenced by these shocks also invest massively into your nation and are tied to your economy, then their failure also has massive rippling effects in terms of causing your economy to fail. That is why we already flipped the case from alt-bench. But we would further prove that there is a massive impact on our side by flipping all of their claims as to why government investment is a bad thing. Think about the reasons why governments have the incentive to invest massively in public services. 3 incentive analysis on governments. Number 1, governments care more about vulnerable groups than private sector, because companies have no incentive to invest in projects that do not generate immediate returns for shareholders, like if they're not profitable, if the consumer market base is not large enough. But as a government, you care about areas in poverty. You care about the welfare of people. And this is for the structural reason that in democracies, poor regions are precisely the one where there's currently low voter turnout, where there are lots of votes that are up for grabs, where people are most intensely caring about issues like employment, and therefore you have the most ability to capture votes by investing in these regions. Current amounts of funding you have obviously do exist on both sides, but the point is that first of all, they're highly insufficient, and second of all, if you have the same level of funding on both sides, we substantially decrease impacts like inflation and debt that are adverse. The second piece of incentive analysis in response to opening opposition is that there's substantially more accountability on our side, because when you as a government have to fund or invest in a certain region, you have to justify that funding to the parties involved or to the public, because voters, as opposed to O analysis, care intensely about the economy. They don't just want a white elephant project. They see the rate of inflation impacting their prices. They see whether factories are shutting down around them, and therefore they want their economic well-being to viscerally improve. Whereas on their side, companies decide on things purely based on economic value behind closed doors. It's often negotiations between certain important figures as to where you build your next factory, whereas on our side, it's necessarily more democratic. Third rebuttal to the O incentive, CEO says there's a lot of short-termism that governments possess. But the thing is, this is only occurring in a minority of instances. You often have things like party affiliations, or you care about your legacy, or you want re-election. These are all reasons why you would not blindly prioritize short-term interests. The end point of this is that you get better and more public services on our side and prevent massive harms. Before I move on to weigh this,
Look, central banks printing money can happen either way, but if the IMF forces you to reform, isn't that what you want? Your harm is less spending and more effective governance. That is a benefit. On our side, at least we get that. On your side, you waste everyone's money and permanently fuck up competitiveness.
Yeah, so it's very unlikely that you're going to just cave to the IMF's demands and reform on either side. Our point is that given there is the same level of demand to subsidize, the same level of demand to invest in public services, which you prove, it's significantly better on our side, where the banking sectors are able to provide you with the capital necessary. Why is this more important than anything alt-bench claims on increasing corporate investments? Because corporate investments prioritize wealthy, privileged individuals at the end of the day, or these regions, because they have the largest consumption power, even if it's about technologies. These technologies are only accessible to really rich individuals. Insofar as, furthermore, economic growth benefits the wealthy individuals disproportionately, it further disempowers poor individuals because it grants wealthy individuals more control over politics, more control over the allocation of resources. So on a comparative level, poor individuals actually feel worse off, even if there is more growth on their side of the house. For uniquely the reasons we explained about the incentives of governments and the incentives of private corporations, we demonstrate to you that we capture the biggest impact of the round and show you that governments actually are good actors, or at least better actors on our side, which is logically prior to most cases made in the debate. For that reason, very happy to propose.
Thanks, GovWhip. To finish off the debate, OpWhip.
Okay, can you hear me well?
Yep.
Great. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to win first by explaining why we win out on investment, but then if you don't buy that, I'll just explain why stability is the most important metric in the round. Note that insofar as we win on this metric, which is what OG prioritizes, we're probably over OO since we engaged GovBench much better. But let's start with where investment is better. What is the CG claim here? CG say government will seek alternate forms of funding that are much worse, like international options with bad conditions or quantitative easing. But it is unclear to me why they don't just cut spending on things that they're currently doing, thus decreasing the debt that they have. If these options really are that bad, if the media covers the reasons that they are that bad, and the public sees this, it is not clear why it's likely the government still seek this out in an irrational way. Secondly, international options aren't actually that bad for the simple reason that there are many international options. You don't have to get loans from Ghana or stuff like that. You can get it from the US or the UK or France. And since there's competition among the lenders, that means that you can still get good conditions on the international market, which is why you also don't have to resort to quantitative easing. Moving on to what OO say here. OO have two problems that we fix. Number one, OO never explained the flip side of why it is that corporations make good decisions. And this is a problem because both GovBench teams attack them on the fact that even if corporations could be good, it's not clear why they invest in the right places and why they invest in the right areas that would guarantee the OO benefits. We explain this by telling you that there's a natural selection to the best VCs, that the ones that rise to the top and have a track record are the ones like SC and Shaw that use quantum computers in order to aggregate data and see what is similar about the kinds of successful companies right now, like past companies, and the way and indicators for success that are proven through big data. We tell you that this is how we get right investment, but that even if they invest in risky things like OG say, this is a good thing, because even if 10 out of 11 startups fail, what you lose out is $1 million. But if they succeed, if these risky things succeed and we never invest in them on their side of the house, this is when we missed out on AI that makes train systems across the world much more effective, meaning that billions of people can get to work better, like agricultural subsidies and methods that are much easier to deal with, like mRNA vaccines that were developed through risky startups and stuff like that, which is which is far greater on scale and the amount of people that it affects and on the vulnerability of these people, as opposed to the people that would lose out by investing in the startup. OG and CG try to say, but we get these benefits too because you have VCs and equity accounts. The problem with this is that one, obviously they don't have that much capital. Obviously they can't invest in as many accounts, since OG at the top of PM concede that most people won't invest in them. But secondly, even if VCs have money, they will never back a startup if there aren't enough people backing the startup. They cannot be the only investor and the only backer because you need a significant amount of money to succeed, and only VC money won't be enough, so they won't invest to begin with. Lastly, the second way I think we weigh over OO is just the fact that, as CG point out, OO is so symmetric. Like, even if you don't get bonds, you'll still invest into bad shit, right? So it's not clear what actually changes on OO. Our explanations for the uniqueness of the money that's able to go into startups and for why it is that you succeed as a corporation in the places that you invest are more unique to why this extent of investment is important. Let's say you didn't buy any of that. Let's talk about stability. OG's mechanism for stability is, but bonds are safe, and then they weigh this as their metric. We explain two things that are each independently enough to beat this. One, why bonds aren't safe, simply because the value of the bond is something that the government wants to raise. CG say no, but you still have incentives like re-election. That's fine. Re-election in most countries is 8 or 10 years. We tell you that inflating the value of the bonds that you sell over time in order for you to get more money, in order for you to not have to cut down on programs in your own country, in order for you to be able to optically alleviate debt, are things that you would do in order to get as many people buying your bonds. But this is unsustainable because just like Russia in 97, when you inflate the interest rate of bonds to 17%, that becomes something that you cannot sustain and that spirals you into a debt crisis. They say, why is this comparative? The reason it's comparative is because corporations have long-term incentives. They're not only here for 8 years. So if they offer interest rates that are unsustainable, this is something that will make the corporation and the people at the head for years on years collapse, which is why they never make these decisions. Also, corporations are accountable to a board of investors that invest in them, that gets a say about these things, as opposed to the party party that decides and the leader and the president that decides based on his 8-year re-election. But secondly, even if you don't think that we ever prove that bonds are less safe, this isn't the crux of Ayal's second layer. What he explains is that corporations are agents that are more likely to be able to pay back in times of crisis because they have more reserves than governments that are currently spending on other things, because they can cut down on advertising or marketing or factory operation, whereas governments can never cut down in times of crisis. They actually have to amp up and offer more stimulation and stuff like that. And all of this means that if you're invested in a bond, you as an average Joe are much less likely to get your money back during a time of crisis, because that's not possible for governments, as opposed to a corporation that will be able to pay you back because they want to avoid suits, because they want to avoid investor unconfidence, since they have more money to do so. We think that this alleviates crisis in a very basic way of allowing people to still afford basic necessities when they need them, of allowing the government to tax this consumption even in times of crisis. Before I explain why this is the most important metric in the round, CG.
So even if your incentives for banks are true, that is still compatible with our argument that banks tend to lobby for significant amounts of deregulation, which we avoid on our side of the house, which lead to recessions on your side.
The response to that is simply that I don't think that the private market works in tandem with the government, for the very simple reason that they still have incentives to not do this. It's the fact that they want to prove that the government fails in order for them to invest in private equity. The fact that there's still competition with government companies and stuff like that, which means that you still don't want the government to succeed as a private corporation, so you don't help them. Okay, why is this the most important thing in the round? Firstly, I want to really quickly respond to the autonomy thing from OG, because they say this in 2 lines and then think it's a silver bullet. No, we think that there are exogenous effects to your investment, so it's not just a concern of what affects you and what is your liberty. But secondly, just like we have civil service that does things because you as an average Joe don't understand them, we think that it's okay for us to make a paternalistic choice in this case because economy is something that you don't understand it. We think stability matters to us most because of the same reasons that OG say. Because it's even if Sharia is right that it's once in 20 years, it's the fact that I can't afford basic necessities. It's the fact that I can't live in the apartment that I am in and I have to evacuate. It's the constant worry of how I will get my next meal. But also, it's something that makes all companies in the market collapse, and not just one or regional problems as OO describes. It's the fact that no company that is invested in another company that has collapsed can survive this period. We think that for this reason, times of crisis matter to us a lot, and we win on that metric. For those reasons, please oppose.
Thank you to Opposition Whip and to everyone in the debate. Please cross the floor, shake hands virtually, and then leave the room to allow us to deliberate. You'll find out the results in a bit. Thanks everyone for a good debate.